to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. Today, we have a really exciting guest on the show, a long-term partner associate of mine and somebody who I've now considered to be a friend. It's Mark Wheeldon, who is co-founder and CEO of a really exciting tech company called Formedics. Like with other episodes, we generally try and get to know a little bit about the person that's appearing on the show, but we try and theme the discussion around a specific topic. And given Mark's background, experience, and the work that Formedics undertake, we thought that a great topic for today's session would be about data standards and automation in clinical trials. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sam. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, great to be invited.
Perhaps you could start us off by sharing a little bit about what are data standards and what's the significance of data standards in our industry?
Yeah, well, the idea of data standards, Sam, came, I think, about 1998 special group at VIA. It rapidly led into the forming of Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium, which most folk would know, but back in 2000, nobody had a clue what CDISC was. But essentially, everybody was kind of doing our stuff all unto ourselves. We were calling every variable we wanted, anything we wanted. Companies in-house had sort of standards of what they would call columns that they were going to submit of data. But really, you submitting Sam, me submitting Sam, we could be submitting on the same drug, and the FDA would basically be doing an investigation job. Does that mean the same as that? And probably the highlight was a set of drugs called non-steroidal anti-inflammatories 2, which were meant to be drugs that removed a lot of the side effects of traditional brufen. So they were meant to remove principally stomach ulceration, so they were a big improvement. What happened was those drugs came, they had potential to be a blockbuster. Pfizer had one, Merck had one. Then there was some issues with one of the drugs. And the FDA essentially couldn't look across, although the two drugs were identical, they couldn't really see whether the Pfizer one or the Merck one had different profiles of safety and effectiveness, because everybody was submitting in different ways. And if you submit in different ways, you can't pull data, you can't get an idea of the overall profile of a drug and how it's going to affect a patient, whether it's going to be safe or work. And so standards give us really a way for reviewers to very quickly understand what's in that data.
I guess to the uneducated like me, it would sound like common sense that you would have these standards in place from the get-go. Why do you think that wasn't the case?
When you look across standards that big pharma or bigger companies had in-house, they weren't that different from others, but there was just no formalization. Essentially, what people were trying to collect was of the same idea. CDISC just formalized it and made it very structured, and also made it really easy to understand the structures, built rules around the structures. You set your study up into findings, interventions, and events. And when you start thinking, that's what I should be doing from a protocol, it starts to make sense. Also, if I've got additional variables, I can put them in these supplemental data sets. As I said, my background is as a pharmacist. I wasn't a data scientist, but I could understand these. I could learn the SDTM, understand the SDTM, and what it was meant to deliver. And that's what made it exciting.
Makes complete sense. And I guess, what's the impact of the introduction of these standards been? Has it shortened things like cycle times? Has it improved other aspects of the whole clinical trial process?
Quality is obviously a key thing. Now, if I've got a contract research company and I'm communicating them, I'm doing it in SDTM. Before the Wild West of CDISC, a CRO could send you data sets back in any format. They'd have to learn one pharma company's stuff, a second pharma company's stuff, a third pharma company's stuff. There's no scale to a trial. Because if I've got a big contract with one pharma company, that's fine, because I understand that. Next pharma company, I don't understand that. So I've got to learn that. I've got to write programs to satisfy pharma company A and pharma company B's deliverables. Whereas if I have SDTM, I write a standard set of programs. Everybody knows what SDTM is. And also we can build rules. So FDA had validation tools and frameworks so that we could make sure that our structures were correct. So the quality of those deliverables, the scale lifted considerably. On the metadata side of standards, it means reusability. For every data standard, there's got to be something that describes that data. So in other words, in Excel, what the column headings are, in forms, what the questions are, but not what the responses are. It means I can have a content library that says, this is what I'm going to gather, this is what I'm going to submit, this is everything in between. It's all standardized. And I can reuse these forms. I can reuse my raw data, STTM. I can reuse my analysis. I can get better predictability. I can also then spend more time on those areas of trials that are new endpoints that I don't have any instruments for, instead of mulling over the old instruments.
Everybody knows that EDC has been around for a long time, so I would imagine what you've just talked about in terms of standards, etc., it's pretty well accepted when it comes to data collection in EDC and other downstream processes. What about things like external data? We often hear about all sorts of external data, ePro, wearable data, and it seems to be growing in terms of the volume of external data being generated in clinical trials. What's the relationship and impact in terms of standards as it relates to that?
Back in the day, CRF data was only ever 20% of trials and 80% was labs. But if you think of biomarkers, wearable devices, all of that, I'd call it now lab data, if you like. So it's a third-party data source. What CDISC gave us the ability really to do was obviously standardize on standard structures, and they built models. But you can kind of manipulate those models to create specs. So in any trial, we obviously create a spec, what we want to collect, what we want to submit. Those specs are traditionally done in Excel. They're laborious, hand typed out. The models that CDISC gave us the ability to auto-generate a lot of those specs. Excel spreadsheets, automatically lay out forms, create facsimiles of EDC forms, exactly like they did. And the reason that was CDISC provided extension mechanisms by which we could add our own metadata. Is it the presentation of a form? Is it additional metadata that a company might want? In other words, I gather that, but I'm not going to submit it. It's not part of the standards, but you can extend the model. So using that in conjunction with things like innovations like metadata repositories, we can virtually create any third-party spec, whether it be a wearable, whether it be a weird test from a lab. It can be any sort, and every single lab will have their own spec, and every device will, and you just store them alongside your standards. So if I'm doing a special genetic one, I might have lab company A, lab company B, lab company C. It uses the models of CDISC. It doesn't use the content standard of CDISC, but it creates ways of creating specs. And more importantly, when they send me the data back, or they send us the data back, we can automatically compare that data matches with the spec that we first thought. So, I mean, those were ideas that were right back there in 2002, 2003. But really only, probably in the last 3 years, has that become a hot topic. How do I get lab transfer specs auto-generated quickly? How do I automatically check my data against my lab transfer spec? And it was the models that got us there, that CDISC models gave us that got us there. So it means that you don't have to tweak your software because it's used to using those models, but you just don't have to apply the content rules of CDISC, which makes it really useful.
That's fascinating. And we hear this quite a lot from our guests. A concept may have established some years back, 15, 16 years back, but the actual adoption only really has started in the last 2 or 3 years, to your point. Have you got a hypothesis as to why that is, Mark, or maybe more than a hypothesis as to why it's only really started to take off the last 2 or 3 years, to the example that you just gave?
I think our industry is a very conservative industry. It took 16 years for the FDA to say, you must submit your data in STTM. And even today, we still use SAS transport files there, a file format that I think was at 1987 or something. Could you imagine running like modern financial technology companies, fintechs, on like structures that were created back in the 80s with all the restrictions of you can only use 8 characters to describe a field? It just doesn't make sense when you look at the evolution of big databases. You just can't imagine that you would still have that. Our industry's slow. They're large players. Even in the smaller players, we have large players. innovation predominantly happens in smaller companies, and the buying of goods from smaller companies by bigger companies, regardless of the industry you're in, is difficult. It requires leaps of faith. It requires people to go out there. And I think also we hold on to technologies too long. Because it takes maybe a year or 2 years to get through a procurement cycle, find a new vendor, there's a tendency to hold on to them for longer, which means that, technology providers maybe not innovate as much as they would. Whereas traditionally, there was always meant to be a 3-year turnover of software. You had it licensed for 3 years, and then people would maybe look at different things. Here, I think it's like 5 to 7 years. It's so difficult to remove entrenched technologies that new technologies maybe don't come in. And also the selling of technologies here, it's slow. So it doesn't gear itself to lots of venture funding, and ventures companies want a return quickly. Software companies in the pharma industry, it takes a long time to get traction. It takes a long time to build critical mass. There's lots of regulation, more and more every day. So your critical mass might be a lot greater than writing a consumer app like WhatsApp, where you can try and you can play a bit more and you can get agile. I think those are some of the reasons from my 22, 23, 24 years in the industry. From the other side of the fence, obviously, as an owner of a software company here.
No, I think they're interesting perspectives, Mark, and it's pretty aligned with what we hear from other guests, actually, in terms of the slowness of adoption to technology and the reasons behind it. We have quite a broad church in terms of listeners, Mark, and we'll have people that are acutely involved in clinical trials from the different functional groups. And then we'll have people that just take more of a passing interest in clinical trials and may not be that deep on the technicalities and some of the terminology. Just something that I struggled with when I first got in this space was really understanding what's the difference between data and metadata, because we hear these terms banded around and talked to, but could you help our listeners understand the subtleties between the two? And obviously they are distinct.
Yeah, the classic makes no sense to me definition of metadata is it's data about data, which means nothing to me. So
I'm glad you said that, because everyone said that to me. I was like, I went round in my head multiple times, like, what are they talking about?
A classic example on a form, case report form, we gather data about patients. So we've got all these questions, we've got all these responses, we've got known lengths. So our age field shouldn't be above 2 characters, for example. We've got responses, yes, no, maybe, whatever. So all of that stuff that generally describes what we're going to ultimately collect, like what's the question text, what's the type of data we're gathering, what are the responses, that's metadata. So the data is the response and the metadata describes. So essentially, if you were to parallel it, we've got Word and Excel for trials, really. Word is the collection of the stuff, Excel's the stuff we're submitting.
Got it.
That's it, crudely. And the column headings are metadata. And it says, these are the terms that we gathered in this. And underneath, all the rows are the data. And that's it, really.
There you go. That's great for our listeners. Next time somebody asks you the difference between data and metadata in the pub, then you can give them the Mark Wheeldon definition.
Data about data. That's the definition.
So yeah, I want to switch gears a little bit and learn a bit more about Formedics. We talked about data standards, and I certainly know what Formedics do and the relationship between the company and the problems that they're trying to solve. But could you talk us through a bit about Formedics, who you are, the problem that you're trying to help the industry solve, and how you're helping them solve it with the technology?
Yeah, so the aim of Formedics principally is to have tools that allow you to design a full end-to-end trial. And by that, I mean a trial from form right through to submission, whether it be a form metadata, whether it be the data set SDTM column headings, whether it be your analysis, whether it be your tables, listing, and figures metadata, or everything about an entire trial. And not only design it, but manage that metadata. So metadata repositories, it sounds like a nice fancy name. Really, it's content management for the entire trial. And a trial has lots of different content in it that relates to different people. Forms, data management traditionally. SDTM might be data management biostats. Analysis would be obviously biostats. And that metadata is different but interlinked and related. So we let people set up standards that say, this is what I'm going to collect. This is my SDTM in between, and this is my submission metadata as well. This is my analysis, my tables, listings, and figures metadata. And what we do is we allow people to design that content, use it as a kind of metadata, content management system, metadata repository for all their trial assets, whether they be different therapeutic areas, whether they be all based on CDISC. Companies can set up their own standards, all based on CDISC or with additional content. And the idea of those systems is to enable reuse and consistency across trials. So in our company, lots of our clients get up to 70% reuse. And obviously reuse improves quality, and it means you don't keep doing the same thing multiple times, speccing it multiple times, checking it's right. You can compare that what you've used in this trial, this study from your standards matches it, or you can tell where it deviates and why it deviates. So that's great. Metadata repository sounds fantastic, but for me, what's really interesting is automation off the back of it. As I kind of said to you before, back in the days, there used to be, I think I worked with a company, 14 people were reviewing the metadata or the design of a trial, if you like. And those folks all had different desires. As a clinician, I just want a form. That's what I've said that I'm going to do in my trial plan, my protocol, and this is the form I've got for it. If I'm a data manager, I want to get in the weeds. I want to see what the data types are. I want to see if the questions are in multiple languages. I want all sorts of stuff. So one of the key innovations for us was, can we get specs quickly? Can we let clinicians look at forms fast? Because we want to lower the author review and approval cycle of a trial to get on to building a data capture solution. And traditionally that was taking 22, 24 weeks. Whereas really with us and technologies like automating specs and automating the build, you should really be doing it like we are in 2 to 4 weeks. So massive reduction, 68% reduction, just because we've not got as many cycle times to review specs. The next stage of that is to embody a willingness to integrate with as much as you can, because we're starting up front. We've got all these data capture systems. At last count, there was about 40 to 50 of them. Can we automate the build of them? Can people see exactly what their form looks like in the leading EDCs quickly and fast? And if they can approve them before the data capture solutions even been purchased, got up, stood up, again, saving time. And that's what we did. We built 8 integrations with 7 different data capture solutions that essentially you could design your study, hit a button, and it built it. And that therefore meant that everything was compressed. You're not transcribing from an Excel spec in an EDC design tool. It's all automated. And again, it all leads to this 22 down to 2 to 4. Then on top of that, you want other areas of automation. One of the slowest and particularly important during COVID is like a kind of lag to data visibility. As I said earlier on, SDTM is the key thing. Lots of companies have lots of technologies geared around SDTM. We work with a tiny biotech. They had 2 people. They want a daily feed of their data. They want to convert it to SDTM. They want to put it into graphing software like Tableau and see results in a sense that makes sense. Again, a clinician, a patient profile, adverse events, occurrence of adverse events. This small biotech company could use our software, pull data directly from the data capture, run a conversion, and see the data. And the lag there was 2 to 4 weeks to set up. Traditionally, it's 8 to 12 weeks. In COVID, you wanted to alter your mappings and how you converted that data a lot because you didn't know much about COVID. So the traditional way of doing that is I create a manual spec, we double program it, we compare the results, we alter them, change the specs, and double code, and keep doing it till we kind of get the same results. You can't do that if you're trying to do 2 deliveries a week. The disease state's changing constantly. You don't know much about the disease that you're doing. And that's why in COVID, A, you need the data quickly, but B, the trials were evolving so much. The mappings were evolving, they were learning, more stuff needed to be put in. And so we enable a way through metadata, through the design of storing mappings and also speccing these data transformations so that somebody that's not a programmer can actually configure a mapping. And the engine is completely validated, so we don't need to do this double coding. And we can see all the mapping specs. the quality of the conversions are better. We can alter the conversions if we see something in the data and capture anomalies in the data. And doing STTM earlier will increase the quality of studies without a doubt. And it will increase the access of blinded data to clinicians to look at what the event of what efficacy and what safety profile of the drug is as quickly as we can. So that study automation piece for me takes the content management thing to a new level. As automating as much of your build as possible, speeding that up. Because ultimately we want subjects in trials quickly. Patient recruitment is still the slowest bit of trials. We want them in as fast as possible. And we want to see our data as quickly as we can to see if the study's effective. And so those two areas for medics about setting up quickly and automating the conversions are key on top of, managing good content in the metadata repository.
It sounds like you're solving some really legitimate problems that need solving and adding a ton of value there. I think particularly around often people, when they talk about technology in the context of clinical trials, the technology sounds like it really stands up at the point of the trial setup, and the trial's been designed, technology's been configured to accommodate that trial as the trial was designed at the point of the trial starting. But then, to your point, something happens during the trial and the database design changes or whatever, and then all of that work is kind of misaligned and misconfigured, and it throws everything out. So you can set the trial up with all good intentions at heart, but then because of a trial change, it throws it all out. And it sounds like what you've done with 4Medics there, it can accommodate some of those challenges. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, a really great example, which everybody will know, is Viagra. So Viagra was a drug that was for cardiac. There was a certain side effect, and we might laugh about it or not laugh about it, but as a pharmacist, diabetics, pre-tablets, it was all injections for male impotence. So you can imagine that the uptake on those male impotence products was not great because they were all injectables. Viagra came along and they were doing it for cardiac, and they saw the side effect, which was obviously helped in male impotence, erectile dysfunction, and they instantly pivoted their study to study it. And it's probably the lives of millions of diabetic men changed overnight by Pfizer being able to see those changes in data and pivot their study quickly. Can you imagine what that means in oncology? I mean, National Institutes of Health said that if you can get a drug to market 5 years quicker, 500,000 life years are gained. So the stuff we're doing here in trials is vital. What happens if we still didn't have a COVID vaccine? Would we all be in lockdown? In decentralized trials, we're an example of a huge accelerator to get a technology to market that would have taken, I reckon, 10 years to be fashionable. But as a result of the pandemic, suddenly became, a key technology. And that's what I said. We have a slow industry, but we also are good at adapting when we really need to adapt.
No, I'm glad you made those points, Mark, because often we get wrapped up in cycle time reductions and ROI, etc. But to what end, right? And it's ultimately got to be to try and get these life-saving drugs to market quicker, or repurpose the indication, as you talked about with the Viagra example. So on things like ROI, is it well accepted in terms of the cycle time reductions and the ROI, etc., that people can expect to enjoy off the back of introducing technology like this? Or do you find you still get a lot of pessimism and conservatism, for want of a better term, when it comes to talking about ROI and other related topics?
I think it's maybe not so much pessimism, but when I entered this industry, we're still doing trials on paper. And I remember for many years, when we went to EDC things, it was all about persuading people that we could gather data electronically. And obviously then a market segment emerged. EDC emerged as a market segment. Other analysts like Gartner and that obviously, looked at the challenges and the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Metadata repositories and standards really don't have their own market segment yet. Okay, I say it was 2000, and I say that we regulated in 2016, but we still have to make a lot of persuasion for the case of why standards are useful. I think Anovian published figures that said that within 6 trials, the payback on metadata repository was there. And then from 6 trials onwards, you're into Clover. And obviously cost avoidance, I think something like $1.5 million in submissions, cost avoidance, because everything's integrated together and you can integrate the data. But the ROI figures, particularly on how you use standards, not that you just have a metadata repository that you automate. It's a new field, and therefore there's going to be a degree of skepticism. And until you do one-on-one comparisons, somebody will say, let's run 2 trials and see how much quicker it is. In the second trial, they're seeing a 70% reduction in ADC. Suddenly nobody's a skeptic anymore. Suddenly people are doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sounds awesome from my standpoint. And if Ivana's been furiously messaging me, I know she's got a couple of questions for you, Mark. Hi, Ivana.
Hey, well, Mark, I was just reflecting on what CDISC has achieved in the past 16 years. I wonder if you have a couple of thoughts on what's next for CDISC, or are we just done defining the standards that we have already?
Well, our work, I think, has only just begun, really. The great job was getting regulatory backing for those standards, and therefore it brought the industry along with it. But CDISC have got loads to do, and there's some great leadership now there. As CDISC 365, Dave Evans, Peter Van Roosel are doing some great work, and they've come from the industry, used the standards. There's so much application skills there, whereas the early days of CDISC it was quite theoretical. And a lot of what CDISC needs to do now is it has good ideas like biomedical concepts. It needs to partner more with tech companies and see if they work in reality. And their approach is very much that now, a partnering approach. Well, we didn't quite get biomedical concepts right. So how can we either dumb them down, make them more acceptable, make them more available to the wider skill set that we have in trials today, work with companies like Formedics and see if they work. The recent things with the bringing of the rules in-house, the open source engine for the rules for STTM, these are great innovations where companies can bolt on. We're not always being asked, did we follow the rules of this? We've got an engine. CDISC have sort of given it its blessing, but CDISC want that to be a platform for companies like mine to integrate our data transformations tools with their conversion tools. Loads of stuff that they can do. The TLF standards still need a lot of work in terms of automation and TLFs. It's an area we're asked every day. Huge savings in TLF, shell automation from metadata, analysis results metadata. It's kind of there, but the automation isn't kind of there. So all of those areas, they've got loads of stuff that you can do. Even the content standards are great. The fact that they're doing more TA and content standards. I wish it was right back to acquisition. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But those packages are getting more robust. And that helps any company that are looking for standards. If you think of CDISC being the kind of salesman for this is what the standards should do, now they're moving it now practically what they can do and how can we partner and execute and make them stronger and work with HL7 to get them working practically. So I think their work, never done, but their work is on a different scale where we were waiting for adoption. There's lots to do with the core standards, but the fundamentals of the standards are pretty strong foundations. And now they can look at other things.
Lots of work to be done still by the sounds of it, but lots of great work already done to build from.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we start to draw this conversation to a close, Mark, we obviously heard a lot about Formedics, but it'd be fascinating to hear about how you came to get into this space and get this clear passion for standards and how to solve problems related to standards. Can you give us a little bit about your background and maybe share something with our listeners that they might not be able to find on your LinkedIn page?
Oh. Whenever I read my LinkedIn page, Sam, I don't know what's up there really, but so my background, obviously, I started as a pharmacist, and I was an industrial pharmacist, which there aren't many of us anymore. But an industrial pharmacist is really aimed at formulating drugs and getting them, anything that's as soluble as sand and we can't get in the body, that's our task. Formulate it so we can get it into the body. And back then, I worked for a company, they were quite advanced. We actually had computers on every desk. We had some sort of email. We actually had video conferencing with the US, and this was years and years ago, before there was really even email. And they ran trials, and I remember there was a big trial room and we were all gathering paper forms and whatever. And then obviously in 98, the internet came along, and I thought, this would be a great thing if we just did electronic data capture and gathered all this data remotely. So Formedics started as an electronic data capture system company. And then one of our great things was the ability to pivot, and folks raised a lot of money, and we were in Scotland and we weren't going to probably raise the amount of money that Phase Forwards and the likes raised. So we kind of pivoted and got into this design and specing space. And even back in that days, we discovered CDISC. Me and one of the guys that is the second guy here at Formedics, who's been here 22, 23 years. And he says to me, I've discovered this thing called CDISC ODM. We can auto-generate entire databases from that. And the story kind of Formedics then was innovation. And really that's what we want to build on. We've launched some new things called Rise Labs, which are just like innovation incubators to look at new CDISC initiatives and just try them out. And it goes back to almost our early days of being a meddling startup, where you don't really know what your definition is. So you just do stuff. And then we were lucky with companies saying, we've got this specking problem. And that's where our first design is, which is the current Rise system. I think it was called Origin back then, and that was it. And so we just want to kind of keep innovating, keep growing on the successes we have of people taking our stuff up, but push the envelope, work faster and harder to get interrelated technologies to what we've done to push to reduce the amount of time it takes to get to trials, to make tools more useful, to remove manual effort. So really what still excites me is there's a lot of innovation to do. And luckily in Formedics, we have the bandwidth to do it, and we have, the will to do it. And we were always formed on being a very innovative company. As you said, Sam, we were probably, some of our stuff was like 10, 15 years ahead of time. But now the time's right for standards, and people are really switched on to optimizing trials and getting them there quicker. So is it different from my LinkedIn profile? But my road to clinical trials was a little different than most. And I've seen it all really, from paper right through to EDC, to decentralized trials, to wearables, to, there's still loads to be done on the back end with warehousing and looking across trials and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question.
It very much does. And we get a big sense of passion about your background and what drove you to the space from that description. And I think from an observer, I also hear great things about the culture at Formedics too. I think you did admit one pretty key detail in terms of your passion and interests, Mark. I think it's well known that you're an avid brewer of homebrew. So maybe you can offer our audience some tips and tricks if they reach out to you and they're struggling to get their homebrew set up and running, if you're open to that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it's the only place, the only standard we care about is good beer. That's the only standard we care. But there are 80 different styles of beer, and every day you could mess with them. So there's no reuse in beer making. Well, there is a little bit of reuse, but you're constantly tinkering. The very opposite of trials where you're trying to get standard instruments. You're constantly tinkering. It's experimental. Back to my old pharmacy days of scale up, and it fits with my old science background. But a lot of love goes into making beer.
I think it does. And I think maybe we've got an idea for our partner podcast show, Transformation in Beers rather than Transformation in Trials.
yeah, absolutely. I could bring some guests along for that.
All right, Mark. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've certainly learned a ton more about the whole topic of data standards, automation. It's always really great to spend time with you. If our listeners have got questions and do want to engage and reach out to you, where's best to come and connect?
Obviously, go to the website, formedics.com. You can submit stuff through there, or even come to me directly, Mark Wheeldon at formedics.com, and I'm more than happy to follow up, set up a call and discuss whatever it is that interests you, worries you about trials, or worries you about standards, or how you're going to implement them, or I'm just new to standards, where do I get started? We have a great team here at Formedics. We still participate in most of the CDISC groups. One of the guys is still building XML for Define. So we have a range of technical expertise from folks who know all about data acquisition standards all through a submission. And if you're stuck with standards, just give us a shout.
There we go. Amen to that. Thank you, Mark, and looking forward to catching up soon.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.